Welcome back to the Training Model YouTube channel. Very thankful that you've checked back in. You probably would have noticed that I've learned how to change the settings on the camera, and all of a sudden now I'm actually in HD, which is great. So I apologize for the first few videos being a little bit out of focus. But today we're going to be talking about hip rotation and the continuum of hip rotation, and we're going to be exploring what both these ends of the continuum feel and look like, and why the continuum idea is my third principle within my gravity first movement model. We're going to start to see how this thing actually plays out within application for coaching. So I've made one slide for today's video, and it is just an expression of a continuum of hip rotation. I've also got my little pelvis here. And ultimately, why do I think understanding these movement continuums is so important? The reason is when we think about motor control, and ultimately that is what we're doing, we're trying to change the way people move to shift tension for performance-based outcomes. It all is founded within the objective world of movement expression. And movement expression is motor control, motor learning, and those branches of the nervous system and how they coordinate and control movement is ultimately what we're trying to do. And in my model, when I think of these continuums, if we can understand and unpack tension, sensation, awareness, and context at either end of the continuum, generally that will mean that we have improved how the entire continuum functions. So if we can really understand and teach and build sensation into true hip internal rotation, and we're going to unpack this today, it probably has meant that we have now, because we know what this very end of hip internal rotation feels like and the context around that, it probably now means that we have a better opportunity to transition towards the other end of the continuum. Problems arise when we are stuck, or we don't know how to move, or we've got mobility restrictions or sort of psychological blocks in moving into specific directions. The body should be able to move in all directions and explore these continuums so that they have it has those options available. So ultimately, that's why I like the continuum idea. And a key part of my coaching framework is understanding the ends of the continuum. Finding tension, feeling awareness, bringing sensation and context to the ends of the continuums is what we're trying to do within our motor control drills. Once we pick that sensation up, take it to training, take it to the gym, and actually start to apply force and do good training. The goal is not to just do these little drills nonstop, but the goal is to actually get to training and loaded and moving well and sharing tension and all of that sort of stuff. So this is why we like continuums, and this is what this is just one example of how I think about these continuums in movement. So let's explore hip ER and IR on the continuum of hip rotation, total hip rotation. So let's unpack hip ER first. The first thing, we know that when we externally rotate a hip, the femur can drive that movement. I like to think of this as like a distal driver of motion. The femur can take or laterally rotate to close the backside of this pelvis, your butt cheek, to close the backside. That's why I've got backside closed here. That can happen with the femur rotating away, but that can also happen with the pelvis rotating away. So the pelvis could rotate away from the femur, and that's also going to close the backside of the hip. We have distal drivers of motion and we have proximal drivers of motion. They have different application within the gym. Where I think most people misunderstand everything happens in rotation is they have the idea that all of the rotation is happening at the arms and legs. And that is just so incorrect when we think about most performance endeavors. Majority of the relative positional changes is actually the trunk shifting left and right side on top of the base of support. And this is why center of mass is so important to understand, but it's actually probably going to be driven more with what is happening at the trunk rather than just this femur rotating on a static trunk. The center of mass is actually what's going to be driving a lot of that hip IR and ER. So you have to understand where the pelvis is in space. So we have to close the backside for hip external rotation. It can be femur driver, it can be pelvis driver. This means that the pelvis would have rotated away from the leg to maximize hip external rotation. So if we think about the pelvis moving away for ER, it means that for IR, the pelvis has to rotate towards that hip and close off that front side. In the frontal plane mechanics of center of mass transitioning, we have what is known as a hip hike, which is, depending on which reference, which left or right side we're referencing. In this case here, we're referencing the right side. Or a hip drop would be that the left side becomes hiked in space. So that would be a hip drop on the right and a hip hike on the left. This here would be a hip hike on the right and a hip drop on the left. But what we're talking about here is frontal plane action at the hip. And what we're going to see is when that hip is hiked on the loaded side, we've actually created an adduction moment. So what we're looking for with the ER is a drop. We're looking to actually have this pelvis lower in space. And you'll see there that all of this musculature here would have experienced a closing, which means we're getting that ER. So anytime that we're going to see this side drop down in space relative to the other side, we're actually getting an external rotation compression or a backside compression here of the hip. So we're going to look for a hip drop. Down the chain, we may see the knee come out. That is now beginning our distal driver of external rotation. We are also going to start to see, as a response to that knee out, and I've got a little one image here, we're actually going to start to see an inversion of the rear foot and a supination of the entire foot. Generally, we'll see a supination of the entire foot, which is going to, from a sensation-based feeling, is going to be lateral foot or heel pressure. So if I bring this across here, this is my favorite image of this, but we're looking at a right foot here. We're looking at it from the backside. This is the talus, sits below the tibia and the fibula. We'll see here that we have these sort of like, I like to think of them as headphones. Pick that up from Eric Cressy, but these headphones sort of cross and grab on to the talus in the frontal plane. So if that talus was going to rock left or right side, so down towards the medial foot here, down towards this side, would see this whole system begin to internally rotate because it's going to take the tibia with it. And we're actually going to see that. And this is our first couple joint action at the lower extremity, where we're going to see an eversion of the rear foot. So the rear foot is going to turn out throughout pronation, which is an internal rotation of the distal shank. The tibia is going to drop down because the talus and the calcaneus drops down medially. So we're actually going to see this whole system couple internal rotation with pronation. What we were talking about initially, though, is that for hip ER, so it's the opposite, the hip ER, we're going to see inversion and supination and lateral and heel pressure within the foot. So let's get that image back up. So this means that if I have my knee out to the right, so my knee is outside right side, what I'm actually going to see is that this foot is going to turn towards midline. So I'm actually going to pick the foot up. I've got a foot here. I'm actually going to pick the foot up and it's going to turn towards midline. And that is because my knee is out. My knee is out lateral, which means my whole system is going to turn towards inversion. My rear foot is going to turn towards inversion. This talus is going to roll out. It's going to take the tibia and the fibula with it, which means the rear foot's inverted, which means we now have lateral pressure of the foot. So our sensation, our awareness of this end of the continuum is going to be lateral or heel pressure. And that is going to hopefully, depending on the relative position of the forefoot, is hopefully going to be bringing in supination which is inversion of the rear foot. The knee will be out. The hip will be dropped down. So we're trying to compress that lateral backside of the hip. The pelvis is then rotated away from midline or away from that loaded side. And we have a closed backside. That is hip external rotation. So now let's unpack hip internal rotation. You'll notice that it's the exact opposite because it is on the continuum. For hip internal rotation, we are trying to close the front side of the hip. That can happen with the distal driver of the femur rotating in, absolutely. But what is more common and not understand enough is that the pelvis is actually probably what's driving majority of your hip internal rotation, because the pelvis is your center of mass. So the center of mass needs to come over that stance leg in order to close the front side to create hip internal rotation. So we're looking to close the front side. In hip ER, we're looking to close the back side. Rotate, the pelvis is rotated towards the leg for hip internal rotation. In this one here, we're going to see a hip hike. So now all of a sudden my right side is higher than my left side. As you can see here, this is now compressing the front side of the pelvis, of the hip, sorry. The pelvis is dropped across and we've created an adduction moment. More than likely, this pelvis is also going to roll around the front side, depending on where load placed and all of that sort of stuff. But we're trying to close this front side, and our hip hike creates that motion for us in the frontal plane with adduction. So we're looking for a hip hike. We're looking for knee in now, the opposite of knee out. And when we get down to the foot, that is the foot, the rear foot is going to evert, which begins the process of lengthening the medial arch and the plantar arch, or the plantar side of the foot, so the bottom side of the foot. If we can lengthen the inside of the foot and the bottom side of the foot, we're creating a pronation. So this is actually going to look like medial and mid-foot pressure. Let's go back to our idea here. Again, talus. If the knee is now on the inside of, or relatively in rather than being relatively out, we will see that relatively in, we begin to drop and we begin to evert this rear foot. The rear foot starts to move away and out. Begins to rotate this way. So this whole system begins to internally rotate, which means talus drops down, calcaneus drops down medially, pressure, tibia and fibula get taken along for that IR ride. Pressure begins to build along the medial inside part of the foot, and then all of a sudden we can start to get length in this section of the foot, which is our pronation. So we need that eversion of the rear foot, and we need length on the medial inside part of the foot. This means that pressure awareness of this end of the continuum has to come from foot pressure. If we can get foot pressure correct, it means that we're probably going to be picking up these foot and ankle relative positions. If we can have the knee on the inside, it means that we can find and drive better foot pressure. We might be looking at a hip hike, and I've got some examples of this, rotated towards, and we're trying to close that front side as much as we can. So we're going to actually have a look at how this plays out with two videos of my current client roster, starting to experience these feelings in two different ways. And again, this is how we would expose tension, awareness, and sensation and context at one end of the continuum. If we can find this position of deep hip internal rotation, true hip internal rotation that's driven by the pelvis and the foot, all of a sudden we will have a better expression of hip rotation across the entire continuum. First up, we're going to be looking at Con here, who's going through a front foot elevated SSB split squat, and we're trying to find all of these feelings of a deep hip internal rotation in this bottom position. The reason is Con has a tendency to overload his back, and in my head, that means that the system's probably driven forward, and if the system is driven forward, it means the pelvis is probably closed on the backside because the whole system has been driven forward. So we're just trying to open up the backside of the pelvis, and we're also trying to open up the backside of his just trunk in general, but ultimately that is all driven through hip internal rotation. So we're trying to build context and awareness down this end of the continuum. This feeling is more common more commonly missing than the other feeling of this continuum, hence why we're spending more time here today. But we're actually just going to look at what this bottom position looks like. So obviously we're trying to find these feelings here. I want you to have a look at this pelvic position. We can see that this pelvic is hiked on this left side. It's higher on the left side, and you can actually see that drop down. This is one of the benefits of having a front foot elevated, is because it actually allows you to get the full range of motion that creates that hike onto the loaded side. So frontal plane, we actually start to load the tissues a little bit differently, which is really good. Another good thing that's happening here is this back leg is starting to come across midline, which also helps drive this hike up. I've never cued that with Con. He's just started to pick that up, which is really, really good. But we're starting to see how we're loading and experiencing some of these things here within this drill. Just want to let you know that it is the final 2 days to sign up to the first intake of the Movement Mentorship. I'm closing the doors on Wednesday night at 11:59 p.m. So if you are watching this before that and you're interested, jump in now for intake 1. Otherwise, the second intake will commence on the 4th of September. Code YouTube can save you 15% off all of my courses and mentorships on the Training Model website. What you can't really see from this angle, but we've got another client doing a different drill, but a similar sort of experience, is that we're trying to drive medial and mid-foot pressure here with Con. So a lot of that force is being driven down through the medial side of the foot. And hopefully that is just opening up and creating some of these feelings from a distal end, a distal feeder of that sensation and awareness and context for Con. So overall, what we are seeing from this angle is we're seeing this hip hike on the left side, which is what we want. We're seeing the knee and the shin stay on the inside. You can really see that here. And we're also driving it from the back leg here. That back leg is starting to come across midline, which drops this right side of the pelvis, which creates this hip hike on the left. So we're getting a lot of this feeling throughout this movement. The other one here, pelvis rotated towards. Hopefully you can see that pelvis is driving around that femur. This glute starts really far back, and then all of a sudden we're starting to drive around that femur as well. It's just another thing. If you wanted to create that more, we're probably going to be looking at a different loading strategy, because the SSB becomes really hard. You'll probably end up just hitting the rack and all of that sort of stuff. But ultimately, we are just trying to find and sense and feel one end of the continuum of hip rotation. More often than not, hip IR is probably what needs more time to develop than hip ER. Now let's go to another client. So this is Connor. Connor, for different reasons, is trying to experience hip internal rotation. We're trying to get him to feel what it feels like to open up the backside of his hip. What you'll see is it's a more regressed movement. It's not an SSB. It's not heavily loaded. It's a little bit more controlled. And as a response or a result of the strategy that we've used for loading, we actually can create way more opportunity to explore, sense, feel, and create awareness and context. And that's another big part of this whole idea of continuums. Your outcome of movement expression is on a continuum as well. We have very sensory-based drills. Generally, they're slower tempo, lower loads, more feedback, more feeling, more proprioception. And then at the other end of the continuum of the outcome of movement expression, we have the output itself. That is generally going to be heavier loads, faster tempos, just good training. We've slid Connor further along towards the sensory-based thing here with a B stance RDL, and we've got just a one dumbbell loading. So here, though, we're going to be looking at the exact same things. This is the second week after one feedback video from Connor, and we're going to be looking at the exact same things because we're trying to expose the system to one end of the hip rotation continuum. So if you think about this, let's just go down the checklist. We've closed the front side here, without a doubt. We've closed this front side of the hip. So we're going to be finding and experiencing length on the back side, which is great. Pelvis is rotated towards. We can see that. If we put like a zipper on his shorts, that zipper is being pulled across, which means that pelvis is rotating around the femur. To get down into that position, we're loading the system with the proximal structures, which is what we want for good rotation. We're seeing a hip hike, without a doubt. Like, we can see it from the line of his t-shirt. We can see how high this right hip is. This hip down here would be down here. So we've hiked that left side, which means we have closed this medial front side of the hip. So we're driving it with some adduction from the pelvis. The knee's in, absolutely. Like, we can see the direction of this knee. I actually would like to see this loaded a little bit more medially, but ultimately, like, for week 2, this is really good. We're right over the foot. The knee's staying on the inside, which means because this knee is on the inside, this foot is starting to evert. That rear foot is starting to turn away to make space for the pronation and the internal rotation of the rear foot to occur, which means that we're going to hopefully have pressure, medial and midfoot pressure here for Connor. So let's just watch a few reps here. Loses a little bit of balance, no drama. Knee stays on the inside. We're rotating around. That knee stays on the inside, which is really, really good. This is looking really, really good. And his feedback this week was, I'm actually starting to feel length into this glute, which is what we're looking for. To lengthen the backside muscles, we have to take the whole system towards compression on the other side. We have to orient everything within the chain in order to actually lengthen those tissues, and that lengthening within the tissues is actually what's going to give the feedback and the sensation to actually then use that to create force and extend the hip. In order to extend the hip with the glute, we probably need to lengthen the glute. And in order to lengthen the glute, we have to experience this end of the continuum of hip rotation. So hopefully that helps more understanding with some of this model that I've got in my brain, and I'm actually starting to throw out into the industry, I guess. This is one example of how a continuum would play out. There are continuums of movements and actions and coupled joint actions everywhere within the system. However, there are a couple of very key ones that most people probably need to experience and explore and create context, awareness, and sensation within. Hip internal rotation and driving the pelvis as far backwards in space as possible is going to be one of the ends of the continuum that are very, very valuable for a lot of people. Just want to wrap this up because I don't think I did a very good job there with the pre-recorded stuff. So I'm just going to wrap this video up myself because I fucked it up there. But thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Please ask any questions if you have any. And hopefully by the end of this video, you're starting to see how some of my model comes together. I plan on doing way more of these sort of in detail discussions about certain particular movements or exercises or coaching and all of that sort of stuff. So if you have any specific questions, let me know because I'd love to dive into some of that content. Again, it's the last 2 days to sign up into intake 1 of the mentorship. It's closing at Wednesday the 26th at 11:59 p.m. We've got 32 coaches in there right now, which blew my expectations. I'm really excited for it, but the next intake will be open on September the 4th, and that will open from Thursday onwards. So if you can't make the first one, the second one will be open. Code YouTube saves 15% off. One last thing, I'm not expecting to get like thousands of views on these sort of things. Like I'd be happy with a couple hundred every video and just a good core group of people that are learning my stuff. But if you do find value in this, please help me out and share it, whether it be on social media or directly with a friend or a colleague or someone who you might find this stuff interesting. It will really help me out, and I would really appreciate it. So yeah, thank you.